Welcome to another sociological theory lecture post-coronavirus. Tonight's lecture is on Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. The book was first published in English translation about 1977, and by Alan Sheridan, who did a wonderful job translating it. Foucault always comes across as such a good English stylist, and always have to remind myself, well, that's really his ode to the translator. So Sheridan did a fantastic job on this. But 1979 is the edition that I have here, the Vintage Books edition. So, okay, let's get started on the book. Now, Foucault. I have a bit of a troubled relationship with Foucault. I really like reading many of his books. In fact, this is one of my favorite books of all time. It easily cracks the top 20, and it's a book that is always a joy to teach. Students always respond to it, in large part because he, like Goffman, is amazingly effective at choosing vivid illustrative material. He's a little bit less effective than Goffman in guiding readers through his arguments. So I actually think that providing you with a skeleton key to the text is a little bit more useful than it might be for, say, Goffman's Asylums, which is almost self-mapped. But at any rate, it's a very good book. So the way I'd like to proceed on this, I think I'm going to do it in three parts. I'd like to get through at least part one on torture, and possibly get through part two, or at least get into part two on punishment. And then I'll reserve another lecture for part three, discipline, especially on docile bodies, and probably get somewhere into the means of correct training. Maybe get through that, and then we'll spend the last sections on panopticism. We may spend an entire lecture on just that. But so let's try to get inside of it. So just to point to it, the book opens with one of the most vivid examples I've read. I think I first read this book in Bob Antonio's postmodern seminar back in like 1992 or 3 or something, and I can remember yet the first time reading through Foucault's description of the drawing and quartering and execution of the regicide Damien, very vividly depicted and very readable, right? So it's one of these places to begin the book that just really grips the reader. So Damien, and I've got actually an image here of there all of this stuff was hard to hunt down about a decade ago. Like, the internet now is full of images of drawing and quartering and images of Damien in particular. So this is actually an etching made from like a contemporaneous sketch of the drawing and quartering of Damien that Foucault describes. You can see here, the horses being hooked up, as we're going to talk about in just a moment, right? So he's supposed to be drawn and quartered by 4 horses. The horses can't quite do it. One of them slips and falls, and so they actually have to hook up 2 additional horses. Again, I have no idea why I'm giggling at this at all. It isn't at all funny. It's absolutely horrible. But it's kind of remarkable that you can actually capture in a contemporary etching here the action that is being portrayed. You see the massive crowds right back here in the back. One of the things that Foucault thinks is really important is that torture must be spectacular, right? Torture cannot function as terror unless it's witnessed by others, right? And so the whole idea of torture was to have it be spectacular. So you see it here almost as though it's this is a theater in the round, a kind of a stage of some kind. And of course, Damien's body is actually elevated on a platform to render it more visible to the crowd. You also have a large contingent of archers was present, and other military crowd control personnel. and I think I know I looked at this earlier and I could swear I saw the dog that was described in here as well, but perhaps not. But at any rate, you can actually see here the image that Foucault is going to draw our attention to. I think I've got another one that's even more vivid. And once you know, I think it's on front and back, isn't it? Yeah. I'll just leave it. Okay, so so the book opens with again, the section is torture, and the first chapter is called "The Body of the Condemned." So Damien's was condemned to make the, I think, I can't, the honorable amends. We'll put it into English. In other words, forced to sort of humiliate himself and make an apology before the door of the Church of Paris. And then after that, so that was a forced apology, and then taken and conveyed in a cart, wearing nothing but a shirt, holding a torch of burning wax, weighing 2 pounds, specified, which is kind of interesting, in the said cart, to the place to grieve, where on a scaffold that will be erected there, the flesh will be torn from his breasts, arms, thighs, and calves with red-hot pincers, and his right hand holding the knife with which he committed the said parasite. So again, there's all this symbolic overdetermination going on here, right? That the spectacle of the torture is loaded with imagery signifying the crime that was committed, that the torture is answering to. So the knife that was used, again, holding the knife which committed the said person, is burnt with sulfur, and on those places where the flesh will be torn away will be poured molten lead, boiling oil and burning resin, wax, and sulfur melted together, right? There's kind of a really interesting cocktail there. And then his body will be drawn and quartered, as you would like livestock in a butcher shop, by 4 horses, right, cut apart, and his limbs and body consumed by fire, reduced to ashes, and his ashes thrown to the wind. So actually, the plan was not to draw and quarter Damien with a butcher's axe, but instead to have the horses actually pull him apart, right? And so there's description about how it doesn't go well. There's all this excessive pain. Damien survives all of these acts. None of it goes well, right? It's one of those executions where the executioner is just having a bad day, right? And so he keeps described as some horrible thing happens to him. He keeps looking at himself. So that's being described here as we go. I won't spend a ton of time. In fact, it's almost too difficult to read it for you. I mean, it's almost too graphic to be recorded in one's voice. But he keeps having to look at himself as he's going through. He doesn't die. Apparently, that right. They have the trouble with the horses. Since I mentioned it, let's do it right. Yeah, they can't do it with 4 horses. So then they try it with 6, and then that doesn't work. So then they change the direction of the horses so that the ones at his head, I think, pulls towards the legs and legs towards the head, something like that. And then, or they pull anyway. They pull across each other, and then that breaks the arms at the joints. He's still alive, still looking at himself, still talking, still asking to be kissed by like the priest, and so on. And then they finally decide, since they can't draw him and quarter him with just the horses, they begin to actually cut him then with a knife, right? And then cutting through the thighs and so on. And then the horses pull him apart, at which point he's still alive, right? And then they burn the torso after that, right? So then the pieces of flesh then were thrown together and reduced to ashes, right? So the sentence, the torture procedure itself, had been pre-established during the whatever trial there had been. And then the executioner had the difficult task here of following through on this theatrical, elongated, performance of the torture. So, it's a common enough occurrence. So this is from an illustrated manuscript. This is actually the drawing and quartering of the, I think the man who betrayed Roland or something like that, right? So a very famous little miniature, probably 13th, 14th century, depicting the drawing and quartering of a traitor, right? Yeah. So again, old form of torture. Okay, here's another one. This is the torture, the scaffold. Again, lifted up. So again, in this old medieval manuscript here, you don't get a large crowd depicted all around, although they would be there. But again, you get this notion of an elevated scaffold that again, like a stage or like an elevated altar in a temple or something, right? So that the eyes of the masses, the spectators that are present, can get a better vision of the impending execution. So it's meant to be a spectacle. It's meant to be observed. The terror function of the torture can only operate if the audience sees it. And in an age before the internet, or an age before broadcast media, and even in an age before photography, right? Or even mass magazines or anything, or visually, illustrated newspapers, being there really mattered. So crowds would be massive at executions, and that was the whole point, that the torture, the elongated, painful, drawn-out torture of the offender was the mechanism by which the terror was achieved. And so punishment of criminals was essentially terrorism against the people who are subject to a sovereign, right? So the king's own subjects are terrorized by witnessing the awesome power of the sovereign being deployed to completely obliterate or painfully eviscerate, right, an offender. So Foucault again opens the book with these descriptions. Here's the other image of the drawing and quartering of Damien. And so you see some of the other parts of it there, right? There's the red hot pinchers, that cocktail of sulfur and hot lead and so on that's being poured in when they pinch things off of him. Here's the fire into which the drawn and quartered remains are thrown, and so on. So again, the agony with which he's undergoing this. But again, okay, so you get a sense of this. So it's a very it is a spectacle. It is a spectacle. It is, R17 to X-rated violence, right? Okay. All right. So that is the spectacular forms of torture that Foucault opens the book with. So he opens it then with two. Here's another. We've got one more to show you there. We might as well do this one too. So again, another medieval manuscript. I don't remember the referent for this one, but it's very well known. And it's again, I can show it because it's kind of cartoonish almost, right? But we're going to find out that the offender that goes along with the torture, that sort of participates in their torture, that essentially admits guilt or asks for forgiveness or something like that as the torture is underway, can gain the sympathy of the crowd and facilitates it, sort of like a good death or a good display, a good spectacle. And so here again, the elevated platform. The platform is elevated for the express purpose of making the torture a spectacle of terror. Okay, and so again, it's part of the design. It's part of the way that power is exercised, as Foucault is going to tell us, is by ensuring that these that the torture of the body of the damned, right, of the condemned, is displayed for all to see, that the pain is visible for all to see, right? And that the kind of trauma of experiencing this violent death is something that will be burned into the consciousness of those in attendance, right? So it's a mechanism for the exercise of power, as he's going to tell us. Okay. All right, so the book opens then with this first vivid, stunningly vivid illustration. He then immediately shifts gears to a second, equally vivid illustration. 80 years later, Léon Faucheux, I'm not sure how we pronounce it, Fauch, drew up the rules for the House of Young Prisoners in Paris, right? So it describes the very carefully scheduled day of prisoners in another facility, or in a facility 80 years into the future, right? So you get up at 6 in the morning in the winter, 5 in the summer. You're going to work 9 hours a day throughout the year. 2 hours a day will be devoted to instruction work, and the day will end at 9 o'clock in winter and 8 in summer, right? So it's a very specified beginning and end of the day. You're going to rise at the first drum roll. At the second drum roll, you're going to get dressed. The third, you're going to have to line up. You're going to get a 5-minute interval between each drum roll. Their prayers are conducted by the chaplain, followed by half an hour by a moral or religious reading. This exercise does not last longer than half an hour. At 5:45 in the summer, 6:45 in the winter, you're going to go down to the courtyard. You're going to get your morning bread, right? And that can't last more than 15 minutes or something like that. And then you've got to get to work by no later than 6 in summer, 7 in winter, right? And then you break for a meal at 10. You go to school for a couple of hours midday, very carefully articulated. What you study is carefully specified and scheduled, right? And then you're going to go back for a little bit of recreation. Then you go back to the workshops for another 3-hour shift. Then you wash your hands, you get some supper, you get a little bit of recreation until 5 o'clock. Then you go back to the workshops again, and then you work until closing time, basically. Then you get cleaned up and then go to bed, lights out. Then they make sure that you're actually, in bed and tired and quiet as you go. So there he says you have it. So this is on page 7 of the book, right? Again, it's very vivid. Any student can work their way through it. Undergrads, grad students. I've used this book in a 300 level undergrad course. You can get this far on your own. And you have these two very shocking portraits of ways of punishment. On the one hand, you have this spectacular public execution, and on the other hand, you've got a carefully mapped out timetable. They do not punish the same crimes or the same type of delinquent, but they each define a certain penal style, right? Less than a century separates them, right? It was a time when in the European United States, the entire economy of punishment was redistributed, time of great reform, right? So a new theory of law and crime, a new moral of political justification of the right to punish, that this all comes about. So modern codes were planned or drawn up, and the old ways of torture died out. In Russia, this happened in 1769, Prussia, 1780, Pennsylvania, Tuscany, 1789, Austria, 1788, France, 1791, and then again in 1808 and 1810, and so on. So there it is. There's two big changes that take place. One of them is the end of torture as a public spectacle, right? And the second one is the disappearance of pain. Pain goes away. You're touching the body a lot lighter. So we're going to get to that here in just a moment. Okay? Okay, so it's a very vivid, very readable, again, account. And if I recall that, Foucault, So again, it really is about the birth of the prison, not so much about the drama of torture and the end of terror. It's about the birth of the prison. So, like if you go to the images, the plates in the book, which begin about page 169 or so, he really doesn't have images in here of torture. The images all are of these carefully regulated prison and penitentiary structures that he's going to write about in these first couple sections. Okay? So it really is primarily about the birth of the prison. Okay. All right. So the skeleton key then to the book. Again, he opens with torture, this illustrative opening narrative of prolonged execution of the regicide Damien in 1757. And then, and then he jumps to 1838. 80 years later, a timetable of the daily discipline and order within the house of for young prisoners in Paris, right? So, and then he claims, all these things have changed. There's a new economy of punishment that's there. And of course, if we know anything about the history of capitalism, capitalism has come on the scene during this time period as well, right? So there's an analysis then of the contrast between these two different penal styles. There are two species of correction, or two species of punishment, right? On the one hand, right, the book opens with torture as a public spectacle, and then we're going to see 80 years later, we wind up in a world where discipline inside of prisons that have walls closing them off to view, right? Discipline is an institutionalized, expertly administered correction, right? So that timetable, it's experts that are designing it, experts that are administering it, right? That are the staff people, in Goffman's terms, that are managing the inmates. So torture as a public spectacle then is located in the long throw of history in the pre-modern or traditional era, or let's leave era out. When a society is in a pre-modern or a traditional position, it tends to emphasize the mode of social control of torture and terror and spectacle. That the citizens within a state are themselves terrorized by the exhibition of the lethal violence, the annihilatory violence inherent in the sovereign, right? So it's all about punishment, and it is very conspicuous. It is the vicarious observation, right? The vicarious experience of being tortured and dismembered and so on, that sort of, again, impresses, the trauma of that impresses upon the subject of the sovereign, of the immense power that the sovereign has. But 80 years later, we have discipline. Again, it's that institutionalized, expertly administered correction. Again, you have modern, rational, scientific modes of social control. So wherever you wind up in modern capitalism, you're going to have this movement away from these old modes of torture and towards discipline as an institutionalized form of rational, scientific social control, right? So corrections rather than punishment. We're trying to correct, not punish. We're trying to reform, not kill, right? It's much more subtle. It's much softer. It's much more gentle in many ways, right? That the crudity of torture isn't there. It takes place on the interior of the subject instead of on the exterior of the body, those kinds of things. So we have these two big modes of that represent, like there's a massive discontinuity between them. So it isn't that torture evolves into discipline. It isn't that the scaffold evolves into the prison. There's a discontinuity that has to be explained, right? It isn't really historical change so much as a break in the historical record, a turning point, a fracture. And then we have the need for a genealogy, which is what he's doing here, to explain where this new mode came from, this new mode of control. Okay, so just to stop here just for a moment, I'm a critical sociologist. I primarily study political economy. I primarily study the way that capitalism ensnares the subject and the way that the rest of society is essentially reconstructed to facilitate capital accumulation. My own work right now is on religion and the religious mode of legitimation of capital. So why are we interested in prisons and punishment? Well, we're interested in a couple of reasons. Number one, the social control mechanisms that predominate within a society are reconstructed by capitalism. So what Foucault is doing here is telling us a little bit about how capitalism reconstructs the basic sort of technologies or techniques that are used by a society to control its population, at least at the level of prisons and crime and punishment and the law and so on, right? But he's also telling us that these modes of control are deployed elsewhere, that they're not just about prisons and punishment and law and legality and so on, but they wind up being modes of control of schools, modes of control in hospitals, in insane asylums, in convents, in in military barracks, in reform schools, in I'm trying to think. I've missed some, but in other words, that all of these disciplinary institutions throughout society. Oh, workshops, capitalist workshops, capitalist institutions like industrial factories and offices and so on. That all of these become subject to a new form of discipline, and that the way that society grabs hold of and constitutes the subjects of disciplinary power in the law, right, in the world of law and punishment, so too does capitalism grab hold of the subjects of capital, the wage laborer, using the same kind of techniques, right? So to me, we're doing this book. This book is important for us who are taking a course from a critical social theorist in the Marx and Freud tradition, because it really is a narrative of changes in social control, changes in discourse, changes in the soul, to use Foucault's terms, that are bound up with the emergence and domination of capital in the modern world. Okay, so as traditional worlds go away, the spectacle of torture and terror goes away, at least within a given society, to be replaced by this kind of hidden a world of discipline within the four walls of a prison. Okay, so that's why this book is important, and it's why I think I continue to think it's one of the most readable and useful of Foucault's books. Okay, now sticking with the notion of a skeleton key, right? So let's not walk through everything. Let's jump right away to sort of the overarching structure, that if you know the following about the book, you can use it as a kind of roadmap, again, skeleton key to open up any other passage or to open up any chapter, or a kind of roadmap to help you get through it. So Foucault himself provides us with a roadmap on page 130 and 131. Actually, it begins a few pages earlier than that. But right at the end of the section called The Gentle Way of Punishment, which is at the end of his section on discipline, he has this, again, kind of summation of where the argument has gone, okay? And then he's going to point forward to his next sort of main task. So again, it's sort of spread out on a couple of pages. Here again, it's page 130 and page 131. You can see my little cobweb drawing that I use when I teach. I tried to reproduce it here a little bit better for us. So let's see if we can't just use this piece of paper to work from. Okay, in these pages, what Foucault does is he sort of recapitulates the argument that he had at the beginning. That what he's looking at is this massive transition that took place. Something happened, right? Where the world of torture and terror, spectacular punishment, was replaced with this new mode of imprisoned, incarcerated discipline as the main mode of social control in Western society. Right? So something happened. So we know we've got at least two modes to talk about. And he's going to tell us here at this page that what he's been working on in the sections that led up to page 130 is he's trying to understand a kind of, I don't want to quite call it a vanishing mediator. In other words, a kind of intermediate structure that emerged to negate the spectacle of terror and then went away, leaving behind the prison. I don't want to quite make that argument, but it comes close to it. So let's just say that there is no direct route leading from the scaffold to the prison, okay? Because the logic of the two, they're so different, right? The logic of torture and terror is all about display and spectacle of the body of the prisoner. But the prison, disciplined conduct, expertly managed within a prison, hides the body of the prisoner, of the offender, right? And places them out of all vision of the public. So the public loses sight of punishment. It's gone. And so whatever goes on within the prison walls is something that cannot be accessed experientially by the general public, right? I always ask my students, how many of you have been inside of a prison, right? I used to take students for tours of prisons at previous jobs that I've had, right? I haven't done that in a while. But really, every adult should be inside of a prison at some point, right? And many of us don't. Even if you do take a little tour, you have no idea what actually goes on. In the same way, as we're going to talk about in a few minutes here, that if you've ever been inside of a coal mine, just like as a journalist or an inspector, you really aren't seeing what actually goes on inside, right? That the brief visitor, right, the tourist going through doesn't see the full structure. Okay, so two completely different logics between this fully traditional world and this modern world, right, of embodied. So both the traditional world and where we wind up in the prison, we wind up sort of the body of the inmate is the target. It's the location of where power is exercised, right? Punishment is exercised. The power of the state, or the power of the apparatus that represents the state, we'll say, exercises itself on the body of the prisoner, both in traditional society when the inmate gets ripped apart and tortured, or in modern systems where the body of the inmate is contained, controlled, not allowed to move, not allowed to do it at once, but must be regimented and coerced into a kind of regime of action. So it is the body that's involved, but it's involved in a very different way. Now, this middle form, this mediating form that comes onto the scene and begins clearing away the old system of torture and then vanishes, right? This system also, like torture, depended upon visibility. So the spectacle of torture is what terrorized subjects and made power effective in the old monarchical regimes. Foucault lays out in the in the section on discipline reform movements that essentially worked not on the body of the prisoner, at least not directly on the body, but instead on the soul. So there were a lot of romantic, rational enlightenment, Christian reformers, especially Protestant reformers, people who were sort of outraged and bothered by the spectacle, the sort of horror and terror of the spectacle, who wanted to see, with more humane treatment, wanted to see prisoners treated differently, and then didn't want to see the public brutalized by these acts of torture, and really thought it was working against public order. It was working against sort of reason as the dominant logic of civil discourse and of civil society. So this medium form that we haven't talked about yet, right, it doesn't operate so much on the body and instead operates on the soul. So this is a kind of rational, soft, gentle form of correction, right? And it's really, again, often done by do-gooders, right? By Christian, Quaker, pietist, some Puritan reformers, even some Jesuits are involved in this, right? Religiously motivated people who think that those who are being processed by state power have souls and therefore deserve something like humanitarian treatment, right? So there's this middle form, and so let's try to work our way through it. So in traditional society, then, the body of the offender, the body of the tortured, condemned person was the site in which the monarch, then the monarchical law, was made effective. In the prisons that we're going to see at the end of the book, in the modern prison, the techniques of coercion, the implementation of habits, of behaviors, is the result of an administrative power that operates, right? The administration of power within a corrective institution. So it isn't the body of a displayed, condemned person being tortured. Instead, it's the body of an inmate who has been placed inside a machine, right? A technical machine for the reform of souls, right? And that then is that the body of the prisoner who's incarcerated, who's held, right, that becomes the site. So in between that is these institutions that are being run essentially with a religiously tuned sensibility. And what we're trying to do in this period of time, in this what he calls the classical moment of penal reform, the classic moment, what's happening is that the reformers want to correct and reform the subject by working on their soul rather than by working on their body. So the body is touched, but the body is touched lightly, and you're instead working on being kind, setting up the kind of a structure of experience that begins to regulate and routinize and calm down the troubled soul, so that and like in Quaker terms, so that the inner light can speak, right? So that the God within can speak again, that your conscience can function, and so on. So in the traditional society then of terror and torture, it is the ceremony of terror that leaves a mark on the body of the condemned by the sovereign and the force of the sovereign. All right? So it is the king's force, the sovereign's power, that leaves a mark on the body of condemned during a ceremony of torture and terror. Okay? So the condemned person then functions as a vanquished enemy. You might as well be an enemy on a battlefield. You're going to wind up dead and eviscerated, bleeding out, right? So again, that's the logic there. And all of this tortured body has to be seen, right, by the crowd in order for power to be effective, okay? So this traditional pre-modern form of power is something that is inherently excessive. It has to be excessive. There has to be a surplus of punishment, right? It has to be painful. The pain has to extend itself over time. And then it's irregularly enforced. You can't constantly be punishing people, or the punishment would lose its effect. People would become coarsened and routinized to the terror. And so the terror is something that can only be administered intermittently. So it's a kind of an irregular explosion of lethal violence and annihilatory violence upon the condemned person that is then again experienced by the traditional subject as a kind of traumatizing spectacle. Okay. Now in the second form, again, what the reformers do is they're going to grab hold of the inmate and they're going to control them, but they're primarily going to be working on the soul. So here what is going to happen more than anything, I'm going to try to get rid of this little thing here that popped up. What's going to happen more than anything is that the social body of the republic, this is something that almost always happens, at least in a constitutional monarchy or republic, where you have something like a democratic system, in a sense that we are all the subject of juridical laws, right? So it's the social body, not the body of the monarch or the king, but the social body that is at issue in the in the application of power, right? So it's we the people of the USA. It's the USA versus someone, right? Or the state of Iowa versus someone, right? So it's the social body rather than the body of the sovereign, right? So and instead of marking the body, you're sending out signs and representations of good and evil and right and wrong and so on to the condemned, right? And so the goal is not so much to directly implant power on the body and force and pain, but instead it's to provide representations to the soul so that the soul can see the right way to go and to find comfort and peace and so on. All right? So it really is a kind of old-fashioned cure of souls in, say, the in the religious sense. So you're not a vanquished enemy. You're a juridical subject, a former juridical subject, which means a subject of the laws, right? In a democracy, republic, we're subject to the law, and so you're a person who was part of the judicial system and the legal system, and you want to be rehabilitated, reconstructed, requalified to return back into civil society again. So you're not a vanquished enemy. You're an autonomous individual who has temporarily lost your autonomy so that you can be reformed, corrected, and then again requalified. Probably reformed is the best way to think about it. Reformatory, penitentiary, right? You're doing penance that you can return to be requalified to return to civil society. So instead of the tortured body, it is the soul with the manipulated representations that take place within the institution of reform, the penitentiary. And so this is the modern form of social control instead of the traditional. Again, it's representative. It is scenic. It is signifying. It is public. It is collective. Okay, so those are all the elements of that mode. But what Foucault is going to tell us, he tells us on page 130, 131, and has been telling us for about 15 pages prior to that, is that for whatever reason, this gentle, sort of caring, humanitarian mode of dealing with offenders, where you're thinking of them as autonomous individuals who can be returned to civil society if we just requalify them, give them penance and help them reform themselves and to be released back out. Instead of that, again, and by the way, this all has to be, I haven't done this yet. So all of this, the body of and the soul of the person who's undergoing reform has to be on display. And so he argues that this form, the classic reformers of, say, the late 18th and early 19th century, these reformers wanted not only to control and rehabilitate and deter from recidivism the specific individual who's being punished, but they wanted that crime and punishment and reform process to be something that's visually obvious, visually known by other subjects, by other citizens, by other subjects of the law, by other juridical subjects, so that all can see the normalcy of punishment in the wake of crime, the justice of punishment in the wake of crime, the inexorability of just punishment in the wake of crime, so that everyone becomes committed to the laws that are just, and the punishment is just, and criminals will be punished. Therefore, the entire social body is going to be legitimated to be obedient subjects of the law, right? Not obeying without thought, but actually internalizing, right? Becoming, again, a juridical subject, someone who has internalized the law and is operating in accordance with it, okay? So in the traditional mode of torture and terror, spectacle of the body of the tortured, of the condemned person being ripped apart was important. The subjects of the crown had to see the crown's power rip someone to pieces. In the modern era, this early modern mode, the classical mode of soul reform, the criminal must be seen to be truly and rightfully guilty of committing a crime, and then be caught not in an excessive display of sovereign power, but instead to be installed within a reform institution that is going to, automatically, not automatically, but will provide the soul with representations that help them to link up punishment with crime, so that they begin to desire conformity to the law and, quite honestly, productivity and wage labor and other things as well, right? So the visibility of the crime punishment system is necessary to both of these. All right? And he calls this the punitive city, or something like the garden. I think I call it the garden of punitive delights as we go on. That's what he's looking for. A kind of visual display, a school, basically, of morality that prisons would be a place where people would picnic, where they would take their children to learn lessons, right? And where even adults would go on pilgrimage so that they could see the lowly state in which criminals are placed, and the reform that is underway, thereby recommitting even adults to a belief in or an acceptance of the judicial and legal system, and a sense that crime doesn't pay, and that we live in a society of laws and opportunity, and that we can obey those and get ahead. So kind of hopelessly, to me, utopian here, but it really was. It was a kind of utopian notion, right? Okay, so in the last pages then of The Gentle Way of Punishment, Foucault says, look, this doesn't ever stick. Instead, we wind up with prisons. So we don't have these open reformatories. We wind up in penitentiaries in the old sense. We wind up with prisons. So what do prisons do? Well, in the modern world, prisons take the body and they jam the body inside a correctional facility, right? But inside of that facility, we're not really fussing with the soul and primarily worrying about reform and redeeming someone's soul or something like that, right? Instead, you're subject to a regime, techniques of coercion, in which habits of thrift, habits of work, habits of sin avoidance are implanted in you, basically drilled into you, right, as an inmate by an administrative apparatus, right? So it is the administrative apparatus that sees you. You're taken out of sight of the social body. Civil society doesn't see you, and you're certainly out of sight of the subject of the sovereign and so on. You're simply inside of an administrative apparatus, where the only people who see you are other inmates and the staff people, right? And what is left on the body then, again, we're going to talk about this, that in this middle period, those who are undergoing reform would be sort of signified. They'd have written on them, or they'd be wearing clothing or some sort of signal emblem that would describe the crime that they've done and the punishment that they're undergoing en route to reform and requalification for civil society. So that what you do and the way you appear in this soul reform is visible. And so it's the sign of the criminal's body, not as something that's being marked with annihilatory violence, but it's a sign of this new legal system of representation and so on. I didn't do a very good job of that, but there you go. But in traditional society, remember, it was the ceremony of horror marked the body, dismembered the body, and so on, cut the body, hands, and all that kind of stuff off of the vanquished enemy. And in the modern penal incarceration mode, you leave the trace of habits, the trace of drill, the trace of a discipline, of not even discipline, of coercion, right? That has been exercised upon you, right? So, and that this all takes place with a kind of repetitive quality to it. A regime is installed, and you are operating as part of that regime, right? So it's almost like the trace of habitual exercise of thrift, labor, avoidance of sin, and so on, that is critical here. Okay, and then in the third section, so it is the individual who's obedient, who's docile, and is subjugated to immediate coercion. That's the subject of this third incarcerated prison system. And that's different from the juridical subject of the soul reform, and that's certainly different from the vanquished enemy of torture. Okay? So you become an obedient, docile individual that is subject to immediate coercion. Okay? All right, so you got the tortured body in the traditional world, the soul with manipulated representations in that transitional world, and then in the modern world, we wind up with the body that is subjected to training, right, and to drill. So traditional, early modern, late modern, basically. And even though that temporality doesn't quite work, he just says that that the traditional world, again, goes away, or at least recedes. Again, he doesn't quite identify locations in the mid-20th century that still were exercising lots of this traditional pre-modern forms of torture and terror. More on that in just a minute. But he presents the soul reform and the carceral penal system, the prison system, as essentially two alternatives. So representation versus coercive corporal control, right? Signifying versus embodied. Public versus solitary and private. Secret versus displayed and signifying, right? That kind of thing. And solitary versus collective. So it's a very, very different thing. So again, in the modern system, we don't wind up with a kind of, again, a school of morality with visible and just crime and punishment that's on display around us. Instead, crime and punishment winds up cordoned in behind the walls of an asylum, behind the walls of a prison, where a regime operates upon the bodies of those who are incarcerated within, without quite worrying about what's going on with the soul. Okay, so so after page 130, then he goes on to start talking about what discipline is like, what a docile body is like, and so on. So I was withholding the term discipline there, and I shouldn't have been. Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah. I misspoke earlier about this. So torture and punishment are the two sections that I was hoping to get through in this video. Probably won't. And then again, with that nice summation on 130 and 131, that is truly the skeleton key to the book. Okay, yeah. So there again, there's a little cobweb model in there. Okay, so in the rest of the book then is an answer to the question: how did this happen? How did did the pre-modern go away? Why did this traditional form of torture and terror go away? And then why did this gentle, humanitarian, caring, do-gooder form of soul reform not become widespread or normal? And why instead did the prison become the answer? Why is the prison the mode of social control throughout modernity? That wherever capitalism goes, you wind up with torture and terror declining, and you really don't get these reform movements. You wind up simply with prisons, right? With prisons. So why do these things go together? Okay, so that's where this goes. All right, before we move on, a few things. I like this book. I think that that Discipline and Punish is truly a great book. It is Foucault at his best, and I think it justifies his inclusion on a list of sociologists one must know and read. Right? Every sociologist must know something of Foucault's work, and this work probably more than any other. So it truly is a great book, and in rereading it for this semester, there was a lot in it that I didn't remember. I especially appreciated moments when he differentiates between Quakers and Puritan and other and Jesuit and other specific Christian reform movements that lent a different sort of theological justification to punitive reform, and that led to different kinds of regimes with different emphases, right? So the Quakers are the ones who are the most interested in the solitary system and quiet, right? And again, this notion that you really do have, that we all are children of God, and that, that if we just remove the encumbrances of life, we can have God speak to us, right? That the white magic of God is available to us if we could only get quiet, right? So they're quiet as if we just get quiet, solitary and quiet. or get in a situation surrounding by other people who are quiet. But it's all about quiet, stillness, quiet the body, quiet the emotions, quiet the mind, almost meditative, and then the spirit will speak, right? That the white magic of the inner light of which is the Quaker term really for the Christian God, will speak. Okay, so the Quakers then really emphasize this notion of getting someone alone and quiet, so that really they can become participants in the soul sharing with the inner light, and that the Puritan reformers had much more of a kind of a work orientation, avoiding sin, regimenting people, and so on. So they were the same, but they shade in just different directions. So a little bit less concerned with silence, a little bit less concerned providing opportunities for meditation or for instructive thought or something like that, and more just about discipline and using up the body's energies in production, redeeming time, as Baxter would say. Okay, so I really appreciate it, and I learn something new every time I go through it, and so it really is worth close reading. And again, these vivid descriptions that run throughout are really fantastic, and they keep the reader interested as you go. Okay, a few problems. Foucault mentions Marx and cites Marx at length, and there is no question that the problem of emergent capitalism and the reconstruction of the subject under capitalism is at issue here. There is some vague recognition of wage labor as the fundamental material condition of working life under capital. But he doesn't seem to have, I guess, a working class consciousness or the proletariat. The sensibility isn't there. So the moments that I wish Foucault would have paused and written more were the moments when Marx is mentioned, or when capitalism is mentioned, or when the profit regime comes up, or the accumulation imperative comes up, right? These basic Marxist terms or terms of critical political economy come up. That these were moments when Foucault really could have explained given more of a face, given more of a kind of personality, a more complete portrait of modern power. Foucault tends to disconnect power from class and from certainly from capitalist interest or accumulation and so on. He tends to disembody power and punishment and so on. He sees them as technicalities and practices and techniques and so on that spread throughout the system. But he doesn't seem to comprehend fully that capitalism is the game in town, right? Now, this is written in the mid-20th century. We still had communist regimes. The Soviet Union was still alive. He apparently was a member of the Communist Party at one point. So he had, this was there. He could have done this. But I think us looking at the mid-20th century as a kind of death of something like communism, and the decay of communism largely into totalitarian regimes or authoritarianism, and then this sort of the neoliberal triumph of capitalism in the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s. That we've seen this happen. So for us, it's easier, I think, probably than it was for Foucault, to just see that capitalism is in the saddle and is righting mankind as Emerson has it, or a slight transformation of Emerson. So capitalism in the saddle and is righting mankind, or capital is, and that means that human beings are becoming proletariats, are becoming wage laborers, and that he mentions it. He keeps mentioning, to his credit, he keeps mentioning how workshops and industry and workplaces and so on, that managers and managerial experts are using the same kind of disciplinary techniques and surveillance techniques and control techniques that prisons use, and that asylums use and that schools use, right? So he gets it, and he mentions it. It just isn't enough to me. And so it's like one of the things I always have to bring out in my teaching about this book is to try to link it to other works. And like, to me, one of the best places, okay, so if you haven't read Capital Volume 1 and really been through Marx's writings about the descriptive writings, especially about the working day and about the transformation of the working day and about what happens to the bodies of workers in various industries as he's working through, absolute surplus value extraction and machinery and division of labor and so on. If you haven't been through that, it's probably hard to see exactly why Foucault should have spent more time there. But I just want to suggest Frederick Engels' Conditions of the Working Class in England, right? That 1845 book where he primarily is in Manchester, right, and touring around. There is a section on mines and mine labor, the mining proletariat. It's available on Marxist.org. That's fantastic. And it's really good because he essentially describes, and a lot of it comes from this, 1832 British mining report, very famous, that Marx cites as well, but of conditions in the mines and the way that children were used in the mines. The length of the working day was incredibly long, and that children were being lowered down. These are kids, right? Lowered down into the mine. The scandal was largely sexual here. That the mines were extremely hot, sweaty. Labor was difficult, and apparently, workers' clothes would get torn and ripped and would tear and get caught. And so women workers, boy workers, girl workers, men workers would often strip to a minimum level of clothing, and then would be working in very, very close proximity to each other in basically the dark, and without, let's just say, without any of these soul reformers or do-gooders that were interested in that second phase. They weren't around. So, this is one of the famous, this is actually a sketch that was in that 1832 report, right? Of a girl chained to a wagon full of coal that she is dragging out of the mine with her body. And again, she's so hot and her clothes are torn, ripped. So again, she's, I think, only clothes from the waist down. Here's another sort of, I think, a later transformation of that image, a little bit clearer. Here's others, little tiny children were employed at the mine to open and close air shafts and to keep air flowing through the mine, and often they would fall asleep and then the mines would explode and so on. So again, Engels is really good at describing the conditions of the workers, including some of the sexual traumas that was experienced by the workers in here. And if you don't get it there, George Orwell wrote a section on the mines, and I can't for the life of me remember the name of it right now. But Orwell, in one of his 1930s novels, wrote of going down into one of these mines and experiencing the conditions of life in the mine, where the ceiling is literally 3 feet, maybe 4 feet tall, and where you have to walk about a mile from the point where you're dropped off in the shaft, right? When you get off of this chain at the bottom of the mine shaft, you've got a mile, maybe 3 miles of crawling or walking hunched over. And before you can even get working, you're not paid for that. You're not paid until you begin actually extracting coal or carrying coal. And so it takes Orwell about an hour to get from the elevator, or this device that lowers him down, to the face of the mine where the coal is being removed. It takes him about an hour to get there, and he's exhausted by that time, and his muscles ache, and he's not used to this, right? So he describes all this, and he describes these little children, again, who are either, who are not very clothed, the men who work near them who aren't very clothed, the way that there are these relationships of a very exploitative kind between the men and the women and children who work down in the mine. So, kind of a very harrowing account. But what's important about it, I'm not just bringing it up to sort of frighten you. What's important about it is that the workers in these mines, especially the children, are subject to brutal terror and torture, basically, right? Their bodies are beaten by their family members, by their mothers sometimes, by the other young workers down there. It's a kind of Lord of the Flies kind of situation, and they are definitely subject to the physical punishment and terror and torture of the men who are working down there, as well as some of the more sort of supervisory personnel. If they don't go to work, they're beaten by their parents, they're deprived of food, they fall asleep on the way home, they're exhausted, many of them die young. So if you read that account and then some other accounts of work in, I mentioned Bishop's book the other day about life in American race slavery, which looks a lot like a total institution, but it has this flavor to it. It really is a terror and torture world. So the images of capital punishment that is being very spectacularly exhibited before a cowering subject population, or at least before a terrorized subject population, is what happened in the American South right through the 1960s. The incredible, sort of continuation of vigilante justice and of or injustice of lynch mobs and so on. Essentially, racial violence of the terror and torture variety in the South. And then that in other parts of industry that haven't modernized and so on, and parts of the world that haven't gone through that modernization, workers continue to be subject to a terror and torture ceremony, right? And so again, there were opportunities for that link that Foucault makes between the exercise of sovereign power to tear apart murder or to tear apart a villain, and the life within pre-modern production facilities, including mines, 20th century mines, which have a kind of pre-modern logic to them, right? That ability to sort of show that mode of power that was pre-modern was actually operative in mines, in plantations, in farm labor, in extractive industries and so on. Anywhere that sort of modern managerial techniques didn't reach, and even in some places where it did, that this mode continued. Okay? Then, as you begin to get into these more modern sections about the regimentation of time, the redemption of time discipline as an important sort of element of soul and body regimentation within the prison, you have this perfect opportunity to connect to E.P. Thompson and that immense literature that's out there that on the making of the English working class, especially this famous article from Past and Present from 1967, Time, Work Discipline, and Industrial Capitalism, where again, in a decade before Foucault's book, Thompson writes about the irregularity and sort of lack of time discipline of workers in early modern industry. And, he especially writes about, things like Saints Monday, the tradition whereby the Catholic Church and the Episcopal Church designated different days of the week as saints' days, and then workers traditionally had honored saints on Saints Monday, and had developed kind of like long-standing traditional rituals surrounding those Saints Mondays, and that tradition of sort of festival and celebration and feasting and drinking and frolicking and so on Monday continued into the industrial era. And it was one of the things that religious reformers and work reformers like Richard Baxter, the arch Protestant ethic man in Weber's work, right? The British Puritan / Baptist who reformed Kidderminster, right? That these people were really all about breaking the hold of Saints Monday and so on. So, work irregularity is talked about on page 72 of E.P. Thompson. This little ditty, you know that Monday is Sunday's brother, Tuesday is such another, right? So Monday is Sunday's brother, so you take it off as well. Tuesday's another. So basically, you have a Saints Monday, you party all day Monday to celebrate the Saints Day. Tuesday, you're sick with a headache, you don't go to work. Wednesday, you must go to church and pray. Thursday is half holiday. On Friday, it is too late to begin to spin. And Saturday is half holiday again. So if you're good at procrastination, you'll probably recognize that. But honoring the saints leads to this really, really disordered and irregular patterns of work, right? So Erie says on page 73, the work pattern was one of alternate bouts of intense labor and of idleness. Wherever men were in control of their own labor, or women in control of their own labor and their own working lives, the pattern persists. And even persisted now, in 1967, among some self-employed artists, writers, professors like me sometimes, where I'll work late at night and then, I'll have a hard time getting focused the next day, and then I'll wind up working again or getting up really early to try to make up what I didn't quite get done the day before, right? That when I'm in control of my own time, I don't have that kind of routine and regimentation. And so he thinks that this still exists among students, that it may well be a natural work rhythm, but this is something capitalism doesn't want. And so this article is about ministers and managerial reformers, not prison reformers, but who essentially attempt to enclose the workers' time, to make workers redeem their time, to try to own the time of the worker, and so on, and to regiment the working day of the worker. So I won't go into this article anymore, but just note again that the opportunity was there for Foucault to flesh out the argument that he makes that these modes of power that grab the subject don't just grab them in relation to political authority, but these modes of power are operative in economic life, they're operative in family life to a large degree, they're operative everywhere, schools and so on. And he says that, of course he says that's part of his argument, but he doesn't quite flesh it out, especially in the realm of the economy and especially in a way that it would link up to the Marxist project. So to me, when I teach, I always like to draw this out, that these modes of power that Foucault is differentiating and the discontinuities that he's recognizing are caught up somehow in the rise of capital. And he doesn't directly theorize how capital and these modes of power are causing each other, but he does note that they are co-emergent, that there is some kind of, and again, he wouldn't use this term, he wouldn't avow this term, but there's some kind of, Weberian elective affinity between these modern modes of control, of prisons, and so on, and modern wage labor, right? That these two things go together, all right? I think I'd better stop this recording and we'll pick it up next time. I hope you found this helpful.